Today, I'm talking to Dr. Tim Moss, cargo expert at Brookes Bell, about microbiological instability in soybeans. Before we get started, Tim, would you like to tell us about your professional background?
Good morning, Alex. Certainly. Thank you for having me. I'm, as Alex said, I'm actually a cargo expert and investigator for Brookes Bell. I've been with Brookes Bell now for 21 years, 8 of those in Hong Kong. Now, in our department in Brookes Bell, we investigate a variety of cargoes, all the cargoes you can think of, really. But the vast majority of the cargoes we investigate are live products like grains and seeds. And of those, the product we look at more than anything else is soybeans. Now, I've been in Hong Kong now for more than 8 years, and the proximity to China being by far the biggest importer of soybeans from various countries, we get exposed to a lot of cases of damage of soybeans. And I would categorically say that the biggest cause of issues is the microbiological instability of soybeans as loaded, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Thank you, Tim. Microbiological instability is not as boring as you may think, so stick with us. Let's get started by looking at some examples. On the left, we see a cargo of soya beans at the loading port in sound condition, and on the right is soya beans at the discharge port showing mold growth and caking. These are indications of microbiological instability and self-heating during transit. What we will be exploring with Tim is how and why this happens.
Here are some more pictures from our files, and these are typical of some of the damage that we see as a result of the microbiological instability and self-heating that arises from that. Now, the photograph on the left, you can see very dark patches of what look like black soybeans. Now, these are known as burnt beans. They aren't actually burnt. And it may look like smoke, but that's actually steam. It's a biochemical process which makes them very dark. And the temperatures here will, they can exceed boiling point 100 degrees easily. On the right, you can see these telltale stripes or grid lines, and these are typical of sweat damage on a vessel. The dark lines are actually drip lines. As you can imagine, the hatch cover above has vertical stiffeners and flanges. So where water condenses on the hatch covers, if it lands on a vertical surface, it will drip down. And then it falls onto the cargo and causes the darkening on the cargo. The discoloration and darkening of the beans and the sweat damages, they're both classic characteristic consequences of self-heating caused by microbiological instability.
What we want to explore with you, Tim, is how a cargo that appears to be in good condition at loading, say in Santos, Brazil, may be found to be caked with a crust of mold, discolored, or with sweat damage when holds are opened in, for example, Rizhao, China.
Let me start with the physical properties of soybeans. Soybeans, you can imagine them as very small spheres or balls that are loaded together. Now, although this dough looks fairly compact, the beans only occupy a relatively small amount of the hold volume. Even when the cargo is settled, at the moment this photograph shows a cargo that is freshly loaded, so it will settle a bit during transit. But even when it's in its fully settled condition, there'll be around about 40% of the cargo volume just as gaps in between the beans. Now, this space is not a vacuum, it's not empty. It will contain air, and the air will contain water in the form of vapor or gas. Now, we always refer to the amount of water in the air as humidity. So that's humidity is specific for air. You shouldn't really refer to the moisture content in the beans as humidity. It's only to do with the air. And the form of humidity we're going to be talking about here more than other forms is the relative humidity. Now, the relative humidity is basically the amount of water in the air as a percentage of how much water the air is able to hold at that given temperature. Now, the relative humidity is actually determined within the interstitial spaces. It's determined by the moisture content of the beans and also their temperature. So the higher the moisture content of the beans and the higher the temperature or both, this will result in a higher relative humidity in the interstitial air. And this is the important point, because a higher relative humidity is one of the critical factors which leads to microbiological instability, and that will in turn drive the self-heating and the effects we've seen already.
Thanks, Tim. But can you explain microbiological instability in more detail?
Certainly, Alex. Soybeans, like any grains, will always have a payload of mold spores. They're everywhere in nature. They're always going to be present on the seed. Now, these mold spores are actually dormant unless the conditions are such where they can germinate. And we've found out with experimentation over, centuries now, the molds will actually germinate and begin to grow when this relative humidity in the interstitial spaces of the soybean hulls is above about 65%. We see faster growth around about 70% relative humidity. The most important thing to appreciate is the mold growth generates heat during its growth phase, and that heat it can't escape from the soybean stove. The soybeans are a very good insulator, and the upshot of this is an increase in the cargo temperature.
Is this picture actually showing the spore that grows mold in soybeans?
This actually, the small structures you can see on the end of they're the mold spores. This is actually a mold cell that's formed a fruiting body. So it's releasing the spores on the end of the cell.
So is it correct to say that mold growth and self-heating is a function of the moisture content at loading, the temperature of the beans, and the time it takes to carry the cargo to destination?
Yeah, that's right, Alexandra. On the next slide, I have a chart. This has been prepared by the University of North Dakota in the States. Now, this being the States, they conduct experiments in Fahrenheit, and the temperature of the beans is shown across the top of the chart. Now, the first figure on the top row is the degrees Fahrenheit, and I've added the equivalent factor of centigrade or Celsius, so we can understand it if we're not in the States. There's a column of the moisture content of soybeans on the left, with an increasing percentage of moisture content as we go down the chart. So what the researchers have done is form samples with this moisture content and hold them at these specific temperatures, and then assessed the soybeans for damage. So I think what you can see here quite clearly is the higher the temperature of the beans and the higher the moisture content, then the shorter the safe storage period. Now, this was actually conducted for silos, storage facilities in load port, but really you can apply this to any situation where beans are going to be held for, a reasonable period. So this could be silos, it could be warehouses, and indeed it does refer to the situation on vessels. So what we have here, you can see from the figures, for example, you may have a time scale where you have a cargo of soybeans which could quite easily get from, say, Brazil to Europe with no problems or no obvious damage. But if you have that extra time taken, for example, to get to Asia, then you may not get the cargo arriving in a fully sound condition.
Let's go back to our example of shipment from Santos to Rizal. The maximum allowable moisture content at export, as stated by ANEC, the National Association of Brazilian Grain Exporters, is 14%. So if the cargo is loaded at 14% moisture in Santos, Brazil, at times where ambient temperatures can be 30 degrees Celsius or more, we can see from the chart that the safe storage times are significantly less than transport times to Chinese ports, and that does not take into consideration the transport time and storage time before the beans are loaded or any delays in discharging.
Alexandra, that's right. It is a problem, and in fact, in reality, it's more complicated than that. The moisture content that's noted on the certificate of quality that's produced before and after loading, is actually an average value of the entirety of the cargo on board. So it could be, easily 60,000 tons. Now, that's only really intended for merchants, commercial purposes, for them to get a sense of the quality of the cargo. For example, how much of the cargo is actually water. That's what they need to know for commercial purposes. It does not give you much information, very, very little information on the cargo's longevity based on these chart data. Now, we know that the portions of the cargo loaded in every instance we've come across where we've looked into it, the cargo may have portions which are significantly higher in moisture content than average. It will also have portions that are lower than the average, but the important thing is the higher moisture content, because this will result in pockets of instability in the stow, and you will get self-heating in a cargo that actually meets the export criteria. I like to say molds take no notice of average figures. They will grow where they can grow. So really, this shipment is only as stable as the portion in which the highest moisture content exists.
Thanks, Tim, for explaining the mechanism of microbiological instability and self-heating. In our next segment, we will talk about ventilation and what it can or cannot do to prevent losses to soybean cargoes.
Thank you, Alex. I look forward to talking with you about cargo ventilation.